Hey everyone, this is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. Today we are going to spend some time talking about Saturn's upcoming entrance into the sign of Aries. For Saturn, this placement was considered a difficult one. In ancient astrology, Saturn in the sign of Aries is said to be in its fall. So today I'm going to tell you why Saturn in the sign of Aries was considered to be in its fall and what that means for us going forward. I think that this will give us some deeper understanding of the dignity placement, which on the surface, if you don't know a lot about it, could be anxiety provoking. So hopefully we'll alleviate some of that stress and anxiety today by providing a deeper understanding of this placement philosophically, and then some very basic archetypal patterns to watch for. So I'm going to give you 5 things to watch for after we break down the philosophical meaning of Saturn in its fall in Aries, why it's fallen there. Anyway, I think that this will be helpful because although Saturn does not enter Aries until the end of May, it's coming up quickly, and it's not a bad idea to eliminate some of the anxiety we might be feeling several months out, right off the bat. So that's what came to me as my little state of inspiration this morning hit. So I was like, all right, let's go for it. So anyway, before we get into it, remember to like and subscribe. We are very close to 80,000 subscribers on the channel. I can't believe it. We had a video that went viral. That was completely unexpected. I think it's one of our best performing videos of all time. The talk that I did on Saturn's death and rebirth in its synodic cycle. A lot of new viewers and subscribers on the channel. Welcome. It's good to have you here. And if you haven't yet subscribed, it does help us grow immensely. So we do appreciate it. We had a goal of getting to 80,000 subscribers by the spring equinox. We're almost there. Transcripts of any of these daily talks can be found on the website, which is nightlightastrology.com. If you like today's talk on essential dignity with Saturn and Aries, check out the events page on the website. Click on live talks. You'll see that on April 3rd, I am doing a talk called Stop Hating Essential Dignities, what they are, why they're real, and what they're used for. This will be like today's talk, but fleshing out the entire set of planetary dignities, how they work, how they're used, what it means if you have one of these dignities in your chart, if you have a planet in rulership or detriment or exile or exaltation. So this will hopefully eliminate some misconceptions, give you some practical tools for interpreting those kinds of planets in your chart or someone else's that you're working with. You'll also see Jupiter exalted in Cancer as our topic for May. June, we're looking at Uranus trine Pluto, which will be taking place over the next couple of years from Gemini to Aquarius. And then in July, I'm giving a talk on the 9th house. So we're kind of continuing to deepen our series on the houses that we've been doing over the past year in July. All right. Well, you can also look through the shop page to see all the other talks I've done, all of which are recorded and archived, and you can get a copy of any of them if you like. All of these webinars, if you attend live, great. If you can't attend live, you do get the recording afterward, no matter what. Also on the events page, be sure to check out our speaker series. The last of our speakers is happening this weekend. Drew Levanti is giving a talk on myth, magic, and magic in ancient astrology. That is free to attend. You just got to register to get the link. There's a recording afterward, again, like everything. Finally, be sure that you check out the affordable reading service under the readings tab. We have tiered pricing so that you can meet with one of our staff on different tiers that meets your budget. And that gives our staff a chance to grow their career as astrologers while giving you guys affordable astrology. So really a win-win situation. All of these things are provided through the Kickstarter, which you guys generously support every year. Okay, on that note, let us now turn our attention to the real-time clock, and let's take a look at Saturn's upcoming entrance into Aries. And I'm going to break this down for you. So here we can see we are Wednesday, March 19th. We're going to be looking at, in the next 2 days, we're going to be looking at Venus and the Sun cazimi and doing some horoscopes. And also we're going to talk a little bit about a plant ally that you can use as a form of magical, spiritual remediation for all of these transits happening in Aries. My wife, Ashley, clinical herbalist, will be coming on the show, and we're going to be talking about a plant that you can pair with the intensity of the end of this month and even Saturn's entrance into Aries, a really good plant ally that has a nice remediating effect for intensity coming from fire signs. So ancient astrologers used plants along with gemstones and many other things for the sake of remediation. In my work, I'm not huge into remediation, but with plants, that's the one place you'll find at Nightlight where you get lots of insight about what plants you can use to work with given certain planetary energies. So anyway, more on that tomorrow and Friday. Today, let's take a look at what Saturn is doing. If I'm going to isolate Saturn here, and I'm going to pull everything out of the chart except for Saturn. And we're going to take a look at Saturn's movement into the sign of Aries. Here's Saturn in Pisces right now, about the 22nd degree here on March 19th. We go forward, and by the end of May, if I go forward just a little bit further here, you'll notice that right on May 25th, Saturn has entered the sign of Aries. So that's early morning, May 25th. So, kind of like May 24th into the 25th, you'll be feeling Saturn changing signs. Now, Saturn will retrograde back into the sign of Pisces. I'll be talking about all the details of the transit in a future video, but the retrograde back into Pisces will be temporary and somewhat brief, and then Saturn is in the sign of Aries to stay, where it'll be there for a couple of years plus. Saturn in the sign of Aries is said to be in its fall. Falls are always opposite exaltations. So Saturn is in its fall in Aries, exalted in the opposite sign of Libra. What we want to understand is not just, that means Saturn's screwed. This Saturn transit is going to be hard and difficult, and Saturn in that sign is bad. And no, this is not what the language of dignities is about. This is not the kind of thinking that the language and philosophical rationale behind the dignities encourages us to adopt. It's not about good and bad. It's not about prescriptive thinking. It is about archetypal dynamism. In other words, what kinds of inherent relationships do archetypes have to one another? And how does that, in those relationships, how is one archetype's expression modified by the presence of another in different kinds of combinations? So with that in mind, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to pull up a little text and read it to you. Okay, so I have a couple of slides from one of the lectures in my first year program pulled up to quote from. This quote comes from an ancient text by an author named Rhetorius, who was likely citing an earlier author named Antiochus. And in this text, he explains the rationale for the exaltation and depression that take place across the sign of Aries and Libra. So, for example, in case you don't know this already, the sun is exalted in the sign of Aries. Saturn is in its fall. Saturn is exalted in the opposite sign of Libra, where the sun is in its fall. So in this passage, the author questions why this is so. I'm going to put this up on the screen now so you can see the quote. Why is it that where the sun is exalted, there Kronos, that's the Greek name for Saturn, is depressed, and where Kronos is exalted, there the sun is depressed? So let's spell that out a little bit more clearly. Why is it that where the sun is exalted in Aries, there Saturn is depressed, and where Saturn is exalted in Libra, there the sun is depressed? So you see how in the exaltation and fall of the sun and Saturn, they are pitted against one another as opposites. We say that it is because the sun is the storehouse of fire and light and is the master of the day, while conversely, Kronos, signifying the darkness, is cold. Then, at the place where the light of day is exalted, this is the sign from the Northern Hemisphere's symbolic standpoint, which is the origin of the zodiac itself, that this is the spring equinox, the place where the light takes over. So then at the place where the light of day is exalted, Aries and the sun's exaltation in Aries, there the darkness and the night, signified by Saturn, is depressed, and that which is cold is warmed. But at the place where the darkness is exalted, remember Libra is the sign of the autumn equinox, when the darkness takes over and the days are shorter than they are long for the rest of the zodiac through Pisces. So, but at the place where the darkness is exalted, Saturn, there the light, sun, is depressed and the day becomes shorter. So, moving on, there's more explanations there. You'll see more of those kinds of explanations and layouts in the Dignity talk that I'm giving, so check out that webinar. But for now, here's what has been said. What has been said is that the placement of Saturn in its fall in Aries has to do with the fact that it is expressing itself, Saturn, in a sign that is contrary to its own nature along the oppositional lines of the sun and Saturn as an archetypal dyad in ancient astrology. Now, if you go back last week, I gave a talk on the sun conjoining Saturn and I said the oldest duality in astrology. That was the subtitle. You go back and listen to that talk, you're going to find a robust explanation of the archetypal dichotomy between the Sun and Saturn. I'm not going to rehash that entire thing because I literally just did a lengthy video on the topic, but I am going to re-summarize it so that we can get into our 5 things to watch for more clearly. So why is Saturn in Aries in its fall? It is because when you place Saturn in the sign where the Sun is exalted, you have a kind of archetypal tension. You're asking Saturn to be Saturn, but in an environment that is a very, very solar-powered place. This puts Saturn into a domain that creates an archetypal tension, and that archetypal tension is expressed by the natural tension that the Sun and Saturn have with one another. Okay, so what does that look like? Well, remember that Saturn is associated with death and limits and transition from death to rebirth, but the threshold is the threshold of death, expiration, old age, exhaustion, tiredness, decay, etc. For ancients who looked at the cosmos as an eternal place where the cycles of light and dark, life and death are ever cycling, ever renewing themselves, they are eternal. Saturn is not just death. Saturn is about the transition across the threshold of death and old age and decay and endings and expirations into new life. But we associate that transition in our mortal bodies with, there's a lot of fear that we have around it. We don't think of it as natural, as evidenced by the amazing amount of focus that is placed on, anti-aging products and everything we can do to stay youthful and young and fresh and alive. We naturally resist Saturn. We naturally resist death. We naturally resist aging. We don't like entropy. We don't like decay. And it's not that Saturn is purely entropy and decay and old age and death. It's that Saturn signifies the natural process of crossing over that and through that threshold, that all of life comes to be and passes away. And that therefore Saturn represents the natural opposite of the Sun, which is life. Life-giving, eternal life, youth. Think about the Sun card in the tarot. You got a little kid up on a horse. It's all sunny. That sense of vitality and vibrance and youthfulness and immortality, all signified by the Sun. Saturn says, yes, but one of the things that makes this life so sweet is the natural process of expiration, of change, of impermanence, even of suffering on a certain level. I mean, one of the reasons that the gods are always saying that they covet mortal life in the ancient world and all of the mythology is that everything tastes sweeter when death is part of the equation. That's hard for us. I know that saying that sounds, it's like, well, that sounds nice romantically, but do you really like death? And I don't think it's ever about liking death as much as it is about recognizing and validating and giving room for its presence as a sweetener. I mean, let's be honest. A lot of things that we love are bittersweet. Romance. I mean, I think about when I was a kid in high school, I remember my girlfriend, this is my high school girlfriend, was over the moon about, I think it was Nicholas Sparks books, but it was The Notebook. Do you guys remember that movie, The Notebook? It's a bittersweet movie. It's a bittersweet story. We love these kinds of things. We love anything infused with just a touch of pain and suffering, because it's the soul, like the spirit in us, that eternal part. James Hillman described as like someone shooting an arrow at a target. He said the soul is taking the arrow in the chest. So this mortal life and the sweetness it brings is the way in which Saturn is entangled and cannot be separated ever from the Sun. All things that are full of life and youth and vitality are, in a way, like a delicate flower that will be stepped on. But, just like some flowers, when they're stepped on, they release their fragrance. And actually, there's some kinds of flowers, and Ashley knows more about this than I do. There's some kinds of flowers that when they're stepped on, they're actually made stronger. And they fortify and grow stronger and more resilient. And some of their medicines come to be because animals walk on them, or people walk on them, or things fall on them. So I'm not suggesting that, I'm not trying to be overly simplistic in how we think about pain or suffering, but the bottom line is that Saturn and the sun bring together the principles of life and death, of light and dark. And they are inseparable from one another in our experience of this world. This is why, going back as old as, biblical mythology, if you just look at some of those early Old Testament stories as mythological and archetypal, we taste from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is also a way of, and in so doing, we enter into the realm of death. So that taste of duality brings us into a realm that tastes so sweet, but it's also the realm of death and of pain. And that the complexity of the choice that the soul makes to come into incarnation to taste that fruit. The gods talk about being interested in that. Okay, so it's I don't really look at that story as evidence that the world is a fallen place and that it's a mistake to taste the fruit of this world. I think there's just something there about knowing that in this world, the dualities of the world are what make it sweet. And if you can connect to the divine through the marriage of opposites in this world, then you're on a path home. If those dualities and opposites drive you nuts, then you're covered in ignorance. And that is also a Sun-Saturn dichotomy, where getting lost in the illusions of this world and thinking you can solve the problem of suffering once and for all while in a mortal frame, problematic, right? That's the covering of ignorance that so many spiritual traditions talk about. We have to develop a transcendental perspective. We have to bring an awareness of our eternal consciousness to bear on our experience of materiality. This is like the work that we're all here to do in some ways, while also living a life that's embodied, that we can taste. So that dichotomy is philosophically a Sun-Saturn dichotomy. So when Saturn goes into the sign of Aries, you are bringing Saturn into a place where you can think of it one of two ways. The sun will try to bring everything that it is into Saturn's perspective, which can be very enlightening for Saturn. The place of death can become illuminated by life and light. The place of endings illuminated by beginnings, right? The place of contraction illuminated by expansion. So it can go that way, which is wonderful. And you'll see that many of the themes of Saturn and Aries include the overcoming of things that are Saturnian through a kind of solar, fiery, heroic effort or energy or momentum. And then on the other hand, you have Saturn making an order at a restaurant that is thoroughly Saturnine, and the sun has to take something of its own nature and provide it to Saturn as a kind of sacrifice, which is where we get all of the difficult themes from. So all of that being said, let me give you 5 things to watch for, and you will see how each of these themes are born of the tension between Saturn and the sun. And these are, I think, the specific kinds of difficulties that we may see that represent the fallen category of Saturn in Aries. These are the reasons that Saturn in Aries can be so hard. However, hard does not mean relevant. Hard does not mean meaningful. It doesn't exclude meaning making or spiritual growth or soul evolution. None of those things are implied. At the same time, if we ignored the basic ways in which we categorize human experiences, this is pleasurable, that's painful, I like this, I'm averse to that, we would be deepening a state of ignorance by bypassing something very basic about our lived experiences, our sensual embodied experiences of life. Like, I prefer getting along with people than fighting with people. If we can't have part of our language acknowledge that consensus level of reality, it makes no sense to have something by means of which we transcend some of that reality, or we bring some higher perspective to it. You have to at least acknowledge it first before that move is appropriate or makes sense. So bypassing dignity categories and consensus ways of describing themes and patterns is really, ironically, very ignorant. So anyway, on that note, these are the things that I think will be most difficult. And we're also going to talk as I go about what could be exciting about the very same theme, how the same theme that looks quote unquote difficult might provide us with very meaningful forms of spiritual growth and of some opportunities to evolve. All right, anyway, number one is impotence and frustration. Remember that the Sun and Aries is a sign that it's almost like a sign of unimpeded growth, unimpeded personal agency, choice, individuality. That word that everyone loves to throw around that's so I think ironically domineering is sovereignty, right? But whatever word you use is fine. The sign of Aries has so much to do with birthing, with inceptions, with starting things, with new beginnings, with youthful vitality, and with, again, unimpeded free movement forward. So much of this is Mars and the Sun in Aries, the two planets that are paired together in this sign as rulers. So Saturn enters this sign, and Saturn is associated with old age, decay, impotence, death, expiration, which is a natural part of the process of life in the material world, cycling. Not bad, but it's not necessarily pleasant. Now we're bringing Saturn into this youthful sign, and we're saying rather than feeling potent, you will feel impotent. Rather than feeling creatively vital, you will feel frustrated. Rather than being able to move forward unimpeded, you are going to find challenge after challenge, obstacle after obstacle to your feeling of freedom or unimpeded, swift movement or agency or choice or sovereignty. You will feel like things frustrate your ability to do those things. However, meeting those kinds of frustrations and challenges is frequently in so many stories, especially heroic stories, which, by the way, Sun and Saturn, Sun and Mars in the sign of Aries reflect. This is the quintessential sign of the hero's journey. Now, that Joseph Campbell had like a boatload of planets in Aries. I looked it up on the show the other day just to confirm because I knew it was true, but then I looked it up and yeah, there was like 4 planets in Aries. The hero's journey is so Aryan. And now we're thinking about Saturn in this sign as the challenges that the hero faces, the obstacles. It is the thing that bites the heel of the hero, so to speak. And the difficulty in having to deal with that, that's a part of every hero's journey story, which is why Saturn is in its fall in this sign. It is the obstacle you have to crawl over on your path to heroic individuation. So think about it that way. When you think about the difficulty, that's not necessarily fun to look forward to, but is it meaningful? Yes. And will you feel stronger and more capable for having persevered and so forth? Yes. And that's the trick, to understand it that way. We're not denying the dignity category, but we're also understanding what evolutionary opportunity it provides us with. Number 2, the failure or revision of solar figures. Look, sometimes, because this is the sign of the Sun's exaltation and of Mars, there are themes in Aries that have to do with leadership. Whether you're thinking of leadership in terms of your relationship with a father or a boss or your own internal authority, which is psychological in nature, or whether you're thinking about it as God, ruler of the universe, a transcendental person that is behind everything. I mean, I think that there are both personal and impersonal dimensions of divinity. So don't get me wrong here, but like a lot of people relate to God very personally. I have a relationship with God or the universe as a being that I speak with. So on that level, your relationship with anyone or anything outside of yourself that serves as a guide, a leader, a father, some source of wisdom, authority, or direction that you turn to or go to, there could be major disappointments around these kinds of figures because Saturn brings expiration or failure or decay or decline or fall to those kinds of figures. And so the death of a leader, also with Saturn is a planet that, insofar as death is a natural part of the process of life, has an ancient relationship with sacrifice. In any kinds of rites and rituals that are connected with life and fertility, there is often an act of sacrifice. This is why Saturn is sometimes called the old scapegoat. Now, insofar as Saturn in Aries can bring challenges or deaths or declines or expirations of solar figures, meaning things like leaders or fathers or authority structures, internal or external, they can also bring sacrificial acts that come from such figures, right? So when someone is a martyr and gives their life for something that they believe in, whether they're a soldier or an activist, like think of that image of the Vietnamese, I think it was a Vietnamese monk that lit themselves on fire in protest. These kinds of sacrificial acts that are bold acts of leadership, but are also sacrificial, the sacrificial lamb, so to speak. There's a whole like school of people out there who believe that Jesus was an Aries because of that sacrificial nature, which has long been associated with Aries. And that's a whole different story. But needless to say, Saturn in the sign of Aries can be about the sacrifices made by leaders, by soldiers, by activists, or by people who are doing something sacrificial on behalf of a mission or a purpose that is higher, but the death comes in or the sacrifice comes in on behalf of it. So the failure, revision of solar figures, also sacrificial acts done as acts of leadership or sacrifice for a higher cause or purpose. These can all be included in what Saturn in Aries brings, which is why there's maybe a sense of the demise or downfall or sacrificial downfall of someone or something. So anyway, you can see how this would be difficult because there are times in our life where even our notion of God or divinity goes through a death and then often a resurrection. This is a sign that because it's at spring, think about the Easter myth, death and rebirth. There's with Saturn in this sign, there's often, it's like Aslan in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, who does a Christ-like act, right? That kind of willing death on the son on behalf of the Son of God, right? That leads to a shift in consciousness or something like that. Again, taking all of these things on an archetypal level, you have something like that with Saturn in Aries. Number 3 are meaningful limits, discipline, and fortitude. The sign of Aries as the exaltation of the sun and the sign of Mars can be about that strong sense of agency, again, sovereignty or willpower. This is my will. It's my way. I am the kind of core phrase for Aries. I am me. Well, when Saturn comes into Aries, it is often going to give these incredible checks of ego and power. It will show you the limits of your will, the limits of your ego. It will show you the shadows of, it brings up like, ooh, you've got a little God complex, and each of us do. Not all the time, but tell me if I'm wrong that you and me and anyone we know can't step into a moment where we think we're the big cheese. It's like you can't. We're just human. It's the ego is not a bad thing, but when it pops up, sometimes what we have to come up against is our relative strength, our relative size, our relative influence. Oh, I'm not as influential. I'm not as big a deal. I'm not as powerful as I thought I was. Now, that can be very frustrating. It can mean that things that you're trying to achieve are much more difficult and you're more limited in your capacity to do them than you thought you were. Or it can be about finding the discipline and the fortitude and the maturity to develop your willpower, develop your authority, develop your ability to do something heroic, but that requires a great act of maturity in order to accomplish. I can't be the immature, selfish version of myself that I have been, relatively speaking. I'm not talking about anyone necessarily turning into the world's biggest narcissist or anything, but to whatever extent our ego stands in the way of our progress, Saturn in Aries will sort of clip our wings, but also empower us through fortitude, hard work, perseverance to achieve things, but achieve things that also bring our ego into like better proportionality. I think that there's nothing better in the world than finding our place and a feeling content. I talked about Aries the other day, an individuation video that I did on Aries about simplicity. One of the most beautiful things about Saturn in Aries is it will say, the simpler you are, the more powerful you will feel. And by simple, we mean that etymological connection to the idea of without conflict. Ironically, when we go to battle with our own ego and our own sense of how big we are or ought to be, or how special or important we are, or how much we overcompensate because we felt stepped on previously, all of those issues around inner worth, inner power are worked on when Saturn is in Aries. And when we come up against meaningful limits, and a diminishment of our ego or a meaningful empowerment of our ego from a place of deeply undervaluing it, whatever the case might be, that work is not easy, but it's so good to not feel like we need to be anything more or less than what we are. And I point my evidence for this point is look no further than your favorite Aries people, because they are great examples of this. All right, number 4, abuses of power, disrespecting limits, authority, or tradition. Well, here we have Saturn as a planet that's representing ignorance, sun, illumination. When the sun and Saturn come together, there can be ignorant demonstrations of power, authority, will, and force. So you can get something very authoritarian, very dictatorial, a God complex, where someone becomes sort of rigid in their sense of self, and there can be like major abuses of power. One of the things that I am most used to seeing in my client practice with clients who have a Saturn in Aries placement is a story, for example, about an abusive father, an alcoholic father, or maybe even an abusive mother, or a really rigid, strict, domineering, authoritarian machismo church that they grew up in. And I'm not trying to be like judgmental. This is how my clients tell me the story, right? So that Saturn in Aries can be about when you were young, your dad was in the military and he was really strict, something as simple as that. Maybe he was a good guy. You'll see stories about when my dad was young, he was a police officer and he was killed in the line of duty. Like there's that Saturn in Aries can be really challenging when it comes to the connections between structures of authority and the difficulties around those structures, like real heavy stuff that has to be worked through around the proper administration of power, limits, authority, tradition, will, strength, and either a feeling of that being totally lost. Like I remember this client who had their dad was in the military and then died. Maybe it was in Iraq. I can't remember. But anyway, and just going from having this heroic presentation of, family military values, a good dad who presented this kind of country, nation, like these values. And then the dad just died. And then it was stepfathers who were shitty. And, like this was a Saturn and Aries story for them that was really prominent in their chart. I'm thinking about this person, this was years ago. But anyway, there's a way in which we have to deal with abuses of power, disrespecting limits, authority, and tradition. Now that can present, weirdly enough, with Saturn. Remember, Saturn rules Aquarius, and Saturn can be about polarities. And so challenges, healthy challenges to authority that represent something like the impulse of revolution can also be Saturn in Aries, which is why Saturn in Aries is also in its fall. It's about the downfall of regimes. It's about the downfall of tyrannical leaders or the opposition from a rebellion against the empire, like Star Wars. That's a very Saturn and Aries-like theme. So there can be like tyrants and opposition to tyrants. Insofar as we have to individuate away from a feeling that there is an angry sky god that has a punitive way of looking at us, that is a Saturn and Aries archetypal motif that many of us go through on the path to individuating spiritually. No, that's not the authority figure I'm going to identify or locate in my psyche as an image of the divine. I'm going to relocate it as a benevolent, wise, discerning, careful, thoughtful. Now we have Saturn in Libra, right? Fair, just, beautiful, right? Sun is exalted in Aries, the source of life and light. We're not talking about a tyrant. But do you see how the two go against one another? There's a process that we have to go through in locating the right relationship with authority, rules, tradition, structure, time, space, mortality. To the extent that we do that in a healthy way, we locate a nexus of power within us that extends into the way we see the universe. This kind of process and having to wrestle a healthy understanding of divinity and power and authority and structure cosmically, metaphysically, is very much a part of Saturn and Aries. And number 5 would be meaningful oppositions. Remember, Saturn is the ruler of oppositions. And so any kind of meaningful opposition that probably presents as a bit of a power struggle can come up while Saturn is in Aries. And that power struggle is probably a very deep and meaningful one. And I don't want to say that it will always be the other person that's in the wrong. We could very much be the problem within the power struggle. So we have to look at both sides of a power struggle and be willing to look at what has gotten us into this kind of struggle in the first place. That shadow work is essential for Saturn and Aries, because even if we're in the right, to understand how and why our own shadows got us into the situation in the first place can still be very illuminating and helpful, even if on another level it's sort of like, someone is being a jerk to us, right? There's always room for self-reflection and multiple layers or levels at which we can explore struggles or power dynamics that are playing out in challenging ways. So anyway, remember all of these things as we approach Saturn in Aries season. I hope that this has been a meaningful philosophical exploration, as well as giving you some really practical things to work with over the next couple of years. These are things, of course, we will revisit on multiple occasions, especially as Saturn gets closer to entering Aries at the end of May. We'll have horoscopes, as always, and many other dynamics that we'll be exploring over the upcoming years. What Saturn, Neptune in Aries, that's at least a few more talks on that subject as well. So anyway, I will leave you there for today, and we will be doing more on Venus's Cazimi and all these transits in Aries over the next 2 days. I look forward to that. We'll see you again soon. Bye.